Welcome. We're talking with Professor Ari Kelman of the University of California, Davis.
I just want to let you know that I just got and your students to know as well, I just got a text from a close friend who is evacuating New Orleans right now because Hurricane Laura is apparently bearing down on the Gulf Coast and has become, because the waters of the Gulf of Mexico are superheated after a very, very hot summer, the hottest summer on record in that region. This storm, which was not particularly dangerous, is now a Category 4 and may potentially be a Category 5 before it makes landfall. So,
yeah, and it looks like it looks like the eye of it is going to hit kind of around Morgan City or a bit west of that. But that means that the bands of rain, that New Orleans gets the worst of it instead of it would be safer if it were to the west.
There is some danger, at least right now, that the path on which it's tracking could shift slightly, in which case it could unfortunately recapitulate part of what happened with Hurricane Katrina, which is that it pushed a big chunk of the Gulf of Mexico up through the Industrial Canal and also through Lake Borgne and into Lake Pontchartrain, flooding both the front and the back of the city simultaneously. So let's hope for the best, but it struck me as poignant that I'm receiving these texts as we're having these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that raises an interesting question because, of course, you did the research and published the book before Hurricane Katrina happened, and I was just wondering, and I know that you came out with a new edition of it in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, obviously, and to what extent did watching Hurricane Katrina sort of confirm your thinking or change your thinking about the things you wrote about in A River and Its City?
That's a really wonderful question. So for the most part, I ended up feeling like Katrina substantiated many of my arguments about the way in which publics are rooted in what we might call social power and economic power, and the way in which different categories or demographic groups are defined as being part of the public, which means that they're worthy of access to public space and also worthy of protection. And then other groups are defined and redefined, because again, the process is always iterative, as being outside of the public. So for example, African-American homeowners, despite the fact that they're by any reasonable definition of middle class in a United States context, that they fit within that category, fall outside of the public in New Orleans. And so what gets described as mid-city, which is some of the lowest ground in New Orleans, but also one of the places that has one of the highest rates of African-American homeownership in this country, is flooded and left to rot, basically, for really months in the wake of Katrina. And so in that respect, at least, the book, I think, did a reasonably good job providing a lens through which to understand a tragedy. On the other hand, I did a very poor job in that I didn't look at tropical storms very closely when I wrote the book. And again, I made that decision because I knew that another scholar was doing similar work, which hasn't actually ever been completed. This is the downside on counting on scholars. They tend to be slow. But I could have and likely should have had a chapter on one of the great hurricanes, probably of the 20th century, maybe Betsy, I don't know, or others. And I think that would have been an interesting and a helpful chapter, which would have done a very, very nice job bringing together a number of themes of the book. But honestly, by that point, I was exhausted, and I was ready to be done. And as you say, it was a dissertation, and it was a very, very long dissertation. It was about 2.5 times as long as the book in terms of word count. And when I presented it to my publisher initially, she fainted, and I had to revive her. And she said, "You must cut this," and so I just got rid of a lot of stuff rather than adding things.
That's interesting. I wonder, so to tie together hurricanes and with one of the chapters, the chapter on the 1927 flood, does your discussion of the 1927 flood help explain the persistent rumors sort of during and in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina that the government blew up the levees, which is prominent in Spike Lee's documentary, or
Absolutely.
it gets some coverage there naturally.
So I have an essay which your students aren't going to be particularly interested in this, but if they are, I mean, if they get really, if they want to do again, forgive me for the sort of riparian metaphor, but if they want to do a deep dive, I wrote an essay in the Journal of Urban History. I don't remember what year it came out, but it was probably 2006 or 2007, called "Even Paranoids Have Enemies, Rumors of Levee Sabotage in New Orleans." And I make exactly this argument, that it was 1927 and then a later hurricane, but particularly 27, is the point of origin for the conspiracy theories that the government blew up well, not a flood wall, I'm sorry, not a levee, but a flood wall fronting the lower Ninth Ward. I believe it's the Florida Avenue flood wall, but I wouldn't want someone to check me on that. But at any rate, that essay does a kind of it's almost a forensic analysis of how that rumor originated. I figured out what I believe is the true point of origin of the rumor, which was a blog post by a woman who at the time was actually, she's a New Orleanian, but she was protesting the Iraq War. She was, I believe, near George W. Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas, when Katrina hit. She posted about this, and other people then picked it up, and it, forgive me during a pandemic for using another particularly poignant metaphor, but it went viral. And I argue that the reason that it went viral is the city's environmental history, that history provided a kind of a fertile seedbed in which these kinds of rumors and conspiracy theories could take deep root. And then, of course, the internet and social media make the transmission of these kinds of rumors far easier than they've been at any time in the past, which is why we're all doomed.
And I suppose in some ways we can sort of see what happened to Mid-City and the lower Ninth Ward in the same context of environmental racism that also operates in the sort of what do you call it, chemical alley, or that chemical factory district up near Baton Rouge, with all of the bad health outcomes as a result of that. And it all is, I mean, it's all different, but it's also all similar.
Yes, and I think that's exactly right, that there's a history of environmental racism, which goes up and down the river. And again, I think it predates 1927. If you think about the way in which so-called or ostensible immunity to yellow fever functioned as a kind of a fulcrum for white supremacy in 1853 and beyond, we see these things recapitulated over and over again. As I say, I think what we're experiencing is the ways in which publics are defined and redefined in such a way that certain groups are left on the outside looking in, and therefore, if they're not understood to be part of the public, if they're not understood to be part of the polis or the citizenry, it becomes okay to discriminate against them, not to provide them with adequate service or adequate protections, which then leads to what I view as entirely understandable paranoia, which again, that's why I titled the Even Paranoids Have Enemies, because in fact, these are groups of people who have been discriminated against systematically, structurally, over the course of decades and even centuries. And having experienced that, they are warier of federal, state, and local authority than they might be otherwise.